Following is a Shaw Public Affairs presentation.
There's an old saying that justice delayed is justice denied, and that seems to be a major problem in today's courts. And I just wonder how Mr. Penner intends to tackle that issue.
Good evening and welcome to Voice of BC. I'm Vaughgn Palmer, and tonight on the show, British Columbia's Attorney General, Barry Penner. Welcome to the show.
It's good to be here.
Okay. We've been talking about change and an era of change in British Columbia, and it is upon us. The legislature sat this week with a new leader of the opposition in the House and a new premier waiting to win a by-election so she can come into the House. Here we are. We've only been around in it to the new era for 24 hours or so, but do you see any change already?
Well, I think the change is upon us is the best way to put it. Clearly, we have seen some change with the opposition taking, I think, a more strident tone, a bit more negative, and that, I think, is not to anyone's surprise.
So Adrian Dix, you think, is just going to take a tougher tone?
I think so, and the downside to that is it will probably be a nastier, less constructive tone than what we had under their previous leader, Carol James, and we know what happened to her efforts. She was deposed unceremoniously by members of the NDP caucus, in part because I think she was trying to be more moderate. Adrian Dix clearly represents a lurch to the left, and I think the fact that he, one of his first decisions just this week was to remove Mike Farnworth as House Leader, signals a more confrontational approach.
I was a little surprised at the Farnworth change because Farnworth was second place in the leadership, as Kevin Falcon was in the Liberal leadership to Christy Clark, and whereas Clark made Falcon Deputy Premier, Minister of Finance, clearly number 2 guy in the government, Dix did not make Farnworth, I mean the number 2 job for the opposition is House Leader, really, opposition leader and then House Leader. And he gave that job to the number 3 guy, John Horgan, Mike Farnworth, out of the job and takes a pay cut as well of $20,000 a year.
Which is, you have to hand it to Adrian. That's a pretty gutsy move to treat your number 2 person like that in terms of the support in the party. Because let's not forget that although Mr. Dix won, clearly he didn't win by a whole lot. It was a pretty tight race.
About the same as Christy Clark defeated Kevin Falcon, 52-48 in the popular vote in the party.
So I guess there could be a risk that that Mr. Dix could be alienating some of the supporters within the party that ended up supporting Mike Farnworth because of the way that Mike Farnworth's just been treated.
Adrian Dix is going to be on this show later on in May. We didn't try to book the new leader of the NDP until we knew who it was going to be, but he will be on the show later in May, I think the 19th of May. We got a couple of other things happening politically. I'm told there's a federal election in Canada, Mr. Penner, on Monday. Are you eyeing this one with the same degree of uncertainty as the rest of us? The polls have suggested in the last few days pretty much everything from a Harper majority to Prime Minister Jack Layton. This is turning out to be a lot more interesting election than we thought it was going to be at the outset.
That's how it's appearing. However, I've learned to make sure I respect voters and not prejudge what they're going to do when it comes time to mark their ballots. So yes, the polls have fluctuated, but we have seen in the past where NDP support has spiked nationally during the middle of a campaign only to dissipate come election day and have trouble converting that into actual ballots in the box. But we'll see. Voters will make up their minds appropriately at the correct time, and I will be very interested to see the results, but I'm not making any wagers at this point.
You brought in a piece of legislation in the BC legislature this week, a bill that you could probably, it's about that big. And I don't mean that thick, I mean that's how many words it took to fill on a single page. Dealing with I guess sorting out finally the question of how we're going to vote on the harmonized sales tax. So we were going to vote in what was called an initiative vote in September, and instead we're now going to have a mail ballot. The ballots start getting mailed out in early, was it June and goes to mid-August?
They should start entering the mail stream around June the 13th, and most people will have received them on or before June 24th. And then they can mark them right away, or they can wait a little while to think about it. or if they're on vacation and come back, they'll have a number of weeks before they have to be returned back to Elections BC.
Yeah, the dates are going to be on the ballot that you get, but basically, the count will be completed sometime after British Columbia Day in August, right? We won't know till August how this thing came out.
That's the expectation, yes. It depends, in part, how many people mail back their ballots. That will determine how many ballots need to be counted, and that will determine how long it takes Elections BC to count the ballots. By moving to this mail-in referendum ballot, Elections BC estimates they'll save approximately $18 million, perhaps more. I'm hoping actually they'll end up saving more than $18 million.
That's compared to the going to the ballot box
correct.
Polling station version.
And when I asked, well, why such a big difference, one of the reasons is that to conduct a traditional style ballot box vote requires Elections BC to hire 37,000 people to staff those polling stations around the province, never mind renting office space. But mostly it's wages that accounts for a lot of that cost. But the flip side is because they're not going to be hiring 37,000 people to count all the ballots, it will take longer to count the ballots because you're going to be doing it with a much smaller staff. That's how you get the savings, by not having to hire 37,000 people, but they'll have maybe 100 or 200 people helping count the ballots and verify everything.
And they told me that they had to order 12 million envelopes, which sounds like a lot of envelopes. There are a lot of British Columbians, but of course there's an envelope to mail it to you in, and then you have to mark your ballot and seal that in one envelope, and then in order to preserve the secrecy of the ballot, you got to put that in a different envelope in order that...
And then those two envelopes go into the return envelope.
That's right, yeah.
So a grand total of 4 envelopes per ballot.
Right.
In order to get it to the person and back and preserve your confidentiality.
It's too late to get the contract to do the envelopes. They've already been done by the Queen's printer, I think. So that's already done because they're already ordered, and they're probably getting ready to send them out.
They're in process now. I don't know exactly how far along they are, but I know that they've been working on it.
Tell me the situation with Premier, because she showed up Wednesday of this week for the first day of the session, Christy Clark, and she did cabinet, and then she went to caucus, and then she had to go off down the hallway to her office to watch the question period, because I guess technically she could sit on the floor of the legislature, because that's a privilege extended to former MLAs, but she couldn't speak.
Correct.
Do you think she's a little frustrated by that?
Knowing Christy as I do, and I've known her since about 1995, I think she would like to speak and certainly contribute to the debate in the legislature and get her points of view across on behalf of the government. And I'm hoping that if the voters see fit in Vancouver Point Grey, that she will be joining us soon on the floor of the legislature. That by-election's on May the 11th.
And it takes a couple of weeks to certify the results, right?
It does, but I'm hoping that before the session's over, she'll be joining us. But again, that'll be up to the voters in Point Grey.
What's your thought on a general election if you were betting? When do you think that would be?
Sometime between now and May 13th, or May 2013. The Premier's indicated that she is open to the idea of going before then. Some people have thought that the set election date precludes that. But that's not my read of the legislation. It directs that the head of the elected government should go seek the legislature be dissolved by that date, or it can happen sooner if the lieutenant governor deems that to be appropriate. And so nothing we could do in the legislature through a bill can preclude the lieutenant governor from exercising his traditional constitutional rights.
Well, we got a lot to talk about your beat, Ministry of the Attorney General. You liking it?
So far, yeah. It's been interesting to reconnect some of those synapses that I used as a lawyer back in the 1990s when I practiced law for a while at Chilliwack, and to revisit some of the lessons learned during 3 years of law school at the University of Victoria. But that's not to say I haven't been around the law since that time, because obviously as a member of the legislature and a member of cabinet, particularly in the Ministry of Environment, much of the work revolves around environmental regulations and statutes. So I've stayed fairly familiar with the process of making law, and it's now times 10 in the Ministry of Attorney General dealing with the law on a day-to-day basis.
But the ministry's crawling with lawyers who are more than ready to second-guess you, I'm sure.
Not that they would ever do that.
We got a lot of questions for you on different things, and we'll go back to some other issues later. But I think we'll start with We'll start with some of the questions on tape, and this one is, you've spoken out on this one, but this one got a lot of British Columbians angry. Here with a question about the case is Bill Thielman.
Alan Dwayne Schoenburn murdered his 3 children and left them to be found by his ex-wife, one of the most vicious and really sick murders we've seen in British Columbia. And yet we found out this month that he was going to be released on escorted day passes from the mental hospital he's been in. How did this happen? How can anyone in the community accept that idea?
You spoke out on this one. I think you were as shocked as everyone.
Yeah, I was surprised to hear about it. First of all, it's a tragedy, and let's not lose sight of that. And there are people still today that are deeply affected by this personally, including the mother of the 3 children, Darcy. I had a chance to meet with her and her cousin for a couple of hours, I guess it was last week. And I'm a new father, and so I can't begin to imagine what it must be like for Darcy or for her friends and family. But I think there's at least two things we have to keep in mind. That for about 200 years, the courts have said, starting in England, that if someone's found to be mentally ill at the time that they've committed what otherwise is an offense, that if they're so mentally ill as not to fully appreciate the nature and quality of their acts, they are to not be treated as a criminal in the penal system, but to be moved to effectively a mental health system. Now, 200 years ago, there wasn't much of a mental health system. What that meant in practice 200 years ago is you were held in custody at the pleasure of His Majesty. And in fact, that practice basically carried on in Canada and in British Columbia right through the 1980s. Because our legislation said you were to be held if you were found to have committed an offense but were mentally ill sufficiently at the time, or criminally insane was the phrase used at that time, you were to be held at the pleasure of the Lieutenant Governor.
Meaning until the
basically cabinet got around to it.
Yeah.
And you can imagine how that worked. So there were people that were convicted of or found to have committed fairly minor offenses that spent many years languishing in detention. And when the Charter of Rights and Freedoms came into effect in Canada, one of the cases that worked its way up to the Supreme Court of Canada was a challenge to those provisions in the criminal code. It said basically people could be held till cabinet got around to it, even if they're mentally ill. And the Supreme Court of Canada, not surprisingly, found that to be a violation of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Parliament had to go back and revisit it. In 1992, the existing provisions, for the most part, most of the regime we now have, came about in 1992 under a previous federal progressive conservative government. And what it says is once a person's been found criminally not responsible because of a mental illness, there are cases to be reviewed at least every 12 months by a review board, and each province must set up a review board. So although the provinces appoint the review boards, the rules they must follow are established in the criminal code, and there's many provisions, all buried within 672 of the criminal code. In looking at those provisions over the last couple of weeks, and even being mindful of the Charter of Rights limitations, I think there is room to move to add extra safety or precautions for the public, and for those most serious offenses, taking people's lives, serious sexual assault, violence against the person, I think we could revisit those criminal code provisions federally so that it's not an automatic review every 12 months, but perhaps every 3 or 5 years or earlier if the treating psychiatrist finds that there's been a material improvement in the person's health. That's the safeguard. So they're not just locked away forever. If there's been a material improvement, then you can file a report with the review board and get a hearing to see how substantial this change is and whether the public safety could be protected if the person's to be released on conditions or otherwise. But right now, Darcy Clark and her friends and family are facing the prospect of another review board hearing that must be held under the criminal code within the next 12 months. That's a treadmill that for victims can be a very daunting.
That every 12 months.
It's a very daunting thing.
We have a few more questions about the justice system, and the next one is from the opposition critic for Attorney General, and he was the opposition critic for Attorney General under Carol James, and he wasn't changed under Adrian Dix. Here's Leonard Krogh.
Mr. Penner, under the Liberal government, in the last 10 years, we've seen a steady decline in the number of provincial court judges available to hear cases. Many cases are being dismissed. In my own community, I received a brown envelope, 4 drunk driving cases dismissed because of delay, because judges aren't available, courtrooms aren't available, prosecutors not available to do their job. What are you going to do about it as Attorney General?
Pretty disturbing stuff.
Yeah, the issue of court delay has been around for a long time. I remember it being an issue in the 1990s when the NDP was in government. And it was around that time that another case went up to the Supreme Court of Canada, Askov, and set some parameters around delay. And it's on that basis that courts can determine if there's been what they consider too much delay that's the result of either the prosecution or the system, that cases can be dismissed. So it is something that I take seriously. Our government did appoint 9 provincial court judges last year.
There's still a shortage of them, though, from what I hear.
We could do with more, but it does cost more. It's not just the cost of appointing a judge, which, you know, their salary and pension and other benefits, but you need to also support that judge, and that costs money. Altogether, if we're including sheriffs, clerks, janitorial, and other support services, the Ministry of Attorney General estimates it's about $1.4 million to $1.6 million per judge to support the whole process. So that's expensive, and we're dealing with a serious economic downturn and budget constraints. So it's true, we are trying to manage to a budget, and while doing that, we're looking for efficiencies and trying to streamline things so we don't have so many repeat hearings before a trial actually starts. One of the things that still surprises me is that the average provincial court case takes, there's up to 7 pre-trial hearings or appearances before you ever get on with the substance of the matter and to get to the merit of it. So we're running a pilot program here in Victoria now to see if we can't get everyone on board to try and streamline that. One of the questions I get from regular people outside the legal system is, why does it seem to take so much longer in our system in Canada than it does in the United States, for example? Yes. And it's been like this for many, many years, that it takes a long time, it seems, to conclude matters. And I don't have a good, fulsome answer for that. It's almost become expected that it takes longer, but I want to make sure that we find other ways, besides just always spending more taxpayers' money, find other ways to try and streamline the process.
Because the Americans have a very activist bar. Their lawyers are not pushovers by any means. They got more of them than almost anybody, and they have a Bill of Rights that's been there for 200 years. So it's not like they lack civil rights.
But some lawyers will tell you, and I've had this mentioned to me, well, they don't feel the justice you get in the United States is as good as the justice in Canada. And that could be. I'm not in a position to say.
Leonard Krog again, and another good question here, this one on legal aid. Here's Leonard.
Mr. Penner, when the Liberals came into office, they cut legal aid funding. It's never recovered. The president of the Canadian Bar Association BC branch said last year that legal aid was in crisis in British Columbia. What are you going to do as Attorney General to ensure that funding is restored to the Legal Services Society and that community law offices that help the poor amongst us are in fact reopened?
And that's Leonard Krog, not Krog.
So a couple things. We have been able, despite the budget challenges that we're facing and the economic downturn, to maintain legal aid funding, core funding from the Ministry of Attorney General to the Legal Services Society of $66.5 million. So that has not gone down this year. We're maintaining that. And there will be extra dollars on top of that for major cases that may come up. There's extra funding for some of those major trials. But it's true, they're living within a budget, as I think most British Columbians realize they have to. The NDP's response to everything, and you'll pick up on this theme, is just spend more taxpayers' money. And if that's going to be their proposed solution for every single social policy issue that comes along, from highways to policing to forests to whatever, the provincial debt will absolutely skyrocket. We are working hard to try and balance the budget and provide a framework for a strong economy. And so the answer to Mr. Krog's question at the end there, how are we going to make sure in the long run there's stable funding for the Legal Services Society and legal aid, is to make sure we have a strong economy to pay for all the services and demands that people have.
We will take a brief break on Voice of BC with Attorney General Barry Penner. Stay with us.
The priorities for the Attorney General should include some commitment to restorative justice so that we can look at alternative means of dealing with people who are first offenders or whose crimes are not very serious.
Your source for in-depth local political coverage. This is Shaw TV, your local voice.
Crime happens, but where it happens and who becomes the victim can be influenced by you and your community. As the eyes and ears of their neighborhoods, Block Watch programs assist police by reporting suspicious activity.
I'm witnessing a theft from a vehicle.
To learn more about crime prevention in your neighborhood, contact your local police department or the Block Watch Society of BC.
If you would like to contact us at Voice of BC, write to us. Our mailing address is 111 1925 Blanchard Street, Victoria, BC, V8T 4J2, or send us an email to vobc@shaw.ca.
What's your thing?
Bugs. My thing's sound effects. Here's a T-Rex.
Nobody's good at everything, but everybody's good at something. What's your thing?
For the second time in the BC Liberal government's history, they've been found guilty by a Supreme Court of breaking the law, of being unconstitutional in ripping up or restricting unions from their collective bargaining rights. Sort of makes you wonder who advises them on the law.
Welcome back to Voice of BC, and since Bill Tillman brought it up, the government did indeed lose a Supreme Court case involving a law that affected teacher contracts in the province. The teachers are asking for, I think, $275 million be put back in the education system to make up for what they lost through that legislation that's now been thrown out. Talked to a couple of cabinet ministers this week, Mr. Penner, not you, but others, and they said the Ministry of the Attorney General is still studying that decision. What, deciding whether or not to appeal?
Yeah, it was a BC Supreme Court level proceeding, and contrary to what Mr. Tillman said, and I understand he's not a lawyer, we were not found guilty. That's something that would happen in a criminal context. This was a civil proceeding, not a criminal.
Pretty damning, though.
Oh, it was a finding, obviously, that the legislation was inconsistent with some provisions in the Charter. So that matter has been sent back to the Attorney General's ministry staff lawyers, and in due course the government will be making a decision about whether or not to appeal. I believe the standard appeal period is 30 days from the date of the decision, so I think that takes us until the second week or so of May for the government to make a decision about whether or not to file notice of appeal.
Yeah, and what the Minister of Education, George Abbott, said this week was the government is obviously not going to say anything about the issue of compensation until, first of all, if it decides it's going to appeal the decision. So that one is still hanging out there. Let's go to this another question. This is a good question from Bill Tillman, and it involves, well, I'll just let him ask the question, and if it needs any background, I'll give it at the end. Here's Bill.
Attorney General, there's been a huge rise in the number of self-represented litigants in our courts. Most notably, Susan Hayes, the Cambie Street merchant, is going to the Supreme Court of Canada with her appeal and representing herself. Does this not indicate that our system is not working, that people should have more money for legal aid, and that the court should be easier to access without spending enormous amounts of money?
The only thing more expensive than losing a lawsuit is winning one, I've been told.
It depends. What Mr. Tillman's suggesting is maybe that the woman who's fighting the Canada Line issue should get legal aid. It's my understanding legal aid typically doesn't provide funding for businesses or merchants, so I think it's probably beyond the ambit of the Legal Services Society, but I'll let them decide that because they do operate at arm's length from government in making decisions around specific cases. But it's true, the judiciary themselves have spoken out about the increasing cost of the legal system and how much it costs for people to be participants in that system. We've seen, for example, since my time as a lawyer, a standard impaired driving case that would be scheduled for a half a day. So you'd expect it to be wrapped up either in the morning by lunchtime, or if you started after lunch, it'd be done before you went home at the end of the day. Today, the standard impaired driving trial is set down for 2 full days. So instead of half of one day, it's 2 full days. So that's a 400% increase.
But you know, you said, and you're right, I've heard the judges themselves express concern about this, but it is often judicial decisions that lead to these cases being strung out. I mean, disclosure requirements that the courts have imposed on the police and on the prosecutors are commonly one of the things that string the case out the longest. Wiretap in complicated cases. And then you got this judgment coming the other way that says, but if it takes too long, then we'll throw the case out because it wasn't speedy justice. So, I mean, the judges themselves have some of the, I know you wouldn't want to criticize judges, but I can. And it strikes me that the judiciary is largely responsible for a lot of these delays.
Well, and to their defense, they're interpreting and applying the Charter of Rights, which puts some limitations on timeliness, but also creates additional constitutionally protected rights to make a full answer in defense, hence disclosure. The leading case there is a case called Regina versus Stinchcombe, which set the bar, and there's been many cases since then interpreting Stinchcombe's obligations or duties for disclosure. But you're right, there are competing forces at play within the legal system, and the unfortunate outcome sometimes is that cases take longer and they cost more. Lawyers don't like to work for free. Some of them, and
I'm in with them on that.
My
hourly rate is a little less, but
I want to compliment those lawyers though that do take time
Yeah.
to provide pro bono services. They work for free. A certain number of lawyers do that every year to help litigants, individuals who can't afford to hire their own lawyer. And I want to take the time to thank those people and encourage more to do so.
It is an amazing thing when they do it. Let's go to a question on drunk driving. Gregory Thomas, Canadian Taxpayers Federation.
That Broadcasters of BC commercial illustrates exactly what's wrong with the BC Liberals. Why would you depict a law-abiding citizen being terrorized at a police roadblock like it's a good thing? Why don't you focus on getting drunks off the road and keeping them off instead?
How's the crackdown on drunk driving going?
First of all, I'm not sure what ad the gentleman's referring to, but I can tell you that the good news is since we've increased the penalties for driving at a blood alcohol level of over 0.05, and by the way, that's been the limit for over 30 years. So if that individual or others were driving at levels of 0.05 or more, they were breaking the provincial law. But what we did was we increased the penalties, and significantly, because we were seeing people starting to lapse back into a more casual attitude about drinking and driving. And the government's very clearly stated intention was to reduce the carnage on the roads. And the preliminary information over the first few months that the system was in place is that there's been a decrease from the 5 to 10 year trend in deaths of approximately 40%. Now that's early information. We'll see if that information holds up. But if 15 people, which is what that works out to, are alive today in British Columbia, then I would challenge Mr. Lanigan to go and tell those families that our law isn't working. But 15 people, it looks like, based on the early information, are alive today because we've taken some steps to remind people that it's not okay to be over 0.05 and get behind the wheel and drive.
It's had an impact. I wonder if some of the impact we've seen in the province on bars and restaurants and business and that hasn't been conditioned by the fact that people are being a little more careful too.
Yeah, I'm hoping that it is changing people's attitudes. That was the idea, was to give people a wake-up call and reconsider and plan ahead. And to be, well, to be blunt about it, think before you drink. Because once you've had a few drinks, we know you don't think that well. That's borne out many times over. So if you're going to go out for a night with your friends, plan ahead. Think about how you're going to get home, instead of just counting on getting behind the wheel and taking a chance. Taking a chance is not only dangerous, but under a new regime can be very costly to you, even if you don't cause an accident.
We got a question on drugs and drug crackdown. Katrina Spacey, Pivot Legal Society. Here she is.
We're very encouraged that the province of British Columbia stood behind and supported Insight, Vancouver's supervised injection facility. But there's so much more that we can do to take a health-based and evidence-based approach to drug use and addiction. My question is whether the provincial government is prepared to consider the findings of Vancouver's heroin prescription trial, which found that heroin prescription is a very effective way to deal with opiate addiction. What can the provincial government do, and what will you do to support this form of treatment in our community?
What do you think?
I don't profess to be an expert on heroin, and it's a little bit beyond my mandate. It sounds like she's talking about a bit of a health-related issue, which would fall under Minister de Jong's jurisdiction. But it's true what she says, that we have taken a position with in the Supreme Court of Canada about the safe injection site, that's really a matter that falls under provincial jurisdiction because we view it as a health issue. As opposed to being a criminal law matter, we believe that the thrust of the initiative is around health. And lately there was some reports out, I think it was in the Lancet, the well-respected international medical journal, that seemed to corroborate that the information that it's having a health benefit by reducing the number of deaths in the downtown Vancouver area.
When you go to Attorney General conferences, and I don't know if you've gotten any of those junkets yet, but I hope you do eventually get to go to an Attorney General conference. Do attorneys...
They sound like a lot of fun, don't they?
Do Attorneys General ever just sit around and, thinking outside the box, say, what if we just, all governments, legalized drugs and poured the resources we are now pouring into policing borders and cracking down on crime and getting in gun battles and all that stuff, and poured that into dealing with the health problems that would result from legalization? Does that ever, is that ever anything, even when you're sitting around at the end of the day sharing a tonic water, does that ever come up?
I haven't been to a federal provincial meeting of justice ministers as yet. I'm not sure if there's one scheduled in the near future. But undoubtedly, if I do get to go, it'll be an exciting experience. That may be a topic that comes up. I'm not aware that it has. We certainly see the carnage, both good and bad. I mean, not that there's good carnage, but I mean, you can make the case that drugs are bad. And so I understand people's impulse to say we should make it a prohibition, but we also see that many people continue to ignore the law and indulge nevertheless, and sometimes to their own detriment in terms of their health, but it's a difficult issue.
Let's go to a question from Bill Thielman. We're back to Bill, and so you brought in this bill this week, changing the date for the vote on the harmonized sales tax. But we're having a referendum now, and as you explained, it stretches from June, July. There is, however, an additional question about that, which is what sort of advertising, what sort of budget is available for educating the public and trying to persuade them to go one direction or the other. Here with a question on it, Bill Thielman.
Attorney General Penner, the BC government announced a $1.7 million budget for the HST referendum for public education and such, but it didn't say how much advertising money it would spend, what the budget would be. Can you tell us now, will it be $500,000, $1 million? And if not, why not?
How much is the government going to spend on this?
Well, first of all, the $1.7 million is going to be part of an education campaign. $500,000 is being made available to the pro and con side, so that will be shared. And it will be the Honourable Stephen Owen, former BC Ombudsman, who will be, I suppose, adjudicating the applications that come in, assuming there's more than one on either side, for how that money is to be distributed. He's also going to play a role in looking after the $500,000 that's being set aside for public engagement, public town halls or debates, dialogues that are being set up through the auspices of universities, colleges, and institutes in British Columbia to provide a nonpartisan forum where people can come out and engage on the issue. And I'm sure there will be people appearing there that will take sides, but the idea is to have a neutral forum, a neutral host, and Stephen Owen will be involved in that process. And then there's $700,000 to go towards a mailer to every, I take it, registered voter or household in the province that will contain information from the various sides, the different sides, as well as some generic government information about how the HST actually works. And it's my understanding that Mr. Owen has also agreed to play a role in overseeing the balance that's struck in that pamphlet or that brochure that goes out. So that's how that $1.7 million is accounted for. The Minister of Finance has indicated that they will also be doing some public information campaigns, and I don't know what that's going to look like. I haven't seen what they're rolling out, but I know that some town hall meetings have just started this week. I think the first one was delayed due to the 7th game of the Canucks.
Entirely appropriate. The Minister of Finance, Kevin Falcon, said he didn't want to be the only person, along with Blair Leckstrom, in the hall the night of the meeting, because
knowing that Blair's a big hockey fan, I'm not sure even he would have been in the hall for that 7th
anyway,
game.
They did put that one off, so yeah, but they are having it.
And a good outcome, by the way. The overtime took a little while to get there, but a good outcome for the hockey game. So there will be a public engagement exercise. One of the things that we were criticized, and rightly so, I think, was not engaging the public more with straight-up information on how does HST work. Many people have been led to believe it's raised the price on everything, when in fact it's increased the price of goods on about 20% of the basket of goods that are out there, which means about 80% of things haven't changed. And some people are surprised when they hear that, because it's not what they've heard from other sources.
The question still, though, is I mean, I would think if the government, I think Stephen Owen, from my experience with Stephen Owen, knowing him for a number of years, and when he was in the NDP government too, as a public servant, that'll be handled fairly, and I don't think anyone's going to have any cause to dispute that. But if the public sees the government going around that 1.7 million and spending a whole bunch more on advertising, television, radio, print, and everything, isn't it going to look like you're trying to stack the deck? I mean, wouldn't it be wiser to just not do any of that? Keep it fair and even-handed?
Well, again, what we were criticized for is not providing the public with information to begin with.
No, what you were criticized for was springing it on people 10 weeks after an election in which it was never mentioned.
Well, that's one of the things we've been criticized for. And you're right, it wasn't the center of that election. I had
the only 2 times it was mentioned, the government said they weren't going to do it.
That was in a survey that was sent to the party office and completed by some loyal staffer. But I personally had 5 or 6 all-candidates debates in my constituency during the election campaign. It wasn't brought up once, and it wasn't something I was contemplating. It was an issue that arose very quickly after the election. We all know the story. The finances were not good, and Ontario was moving to adopt the HST, and so we moved quickly to meet the federal timelines. And that did not give us time to get out and explain to the public how it works, what the upsides are and what the downsides are. And the ultimate test and check on government for whatever information the Ministry of Finance rolls out will be up to the public. The public has a pretty good sense of these things. And if they think that it's just a one-sided sales job, then I would agree with you. It will not be effective. And so I'm confident that the Ministry of Finance won't do that. I think the best way to explain it to people is just to be straight up. Here's the upside, here's the downside. You choose.
Here's a tough one. This would probably cause the government more trouble than almost anything. But the HST, what could that be? BC Rail case. Paul Ramsey, here he is.
One of the real dark clouds hanging over the Attorney General's ministry is the decision to grant $6 million in legal fees to Bassey and Verk, the defendants in the BC Rail case. And I understand the government is now doing an investigation of the policy. Well, frankly, that just won't cut it politically. What people want is for that decision to be reversed or at least tempered. They don't give a darn about investigating policy.
Well, what kind of a review are you conducting, Mr. Penner?
Well, first, just to go to Mr. Ramsey's comment, again, I also appreciate he's not a lawyer. But if he was, he would understand that you can't now upturn or reverse the decision upon which the case was concluded. The case has been concluded on a variety of terms, and the matter's over. So the prospect of setting the date back is not open to us. That decision was made not by elected people, but by unelected people, the senior civil servants that were overseeing that particular case, as they do other particular cases involving indemnity or legal fees being paid for people working for government. That case has been has ended, But what I'm concerned about is how did that indemnity policy get to that point where the civil servants were making those decisions along those lines. So I think you've written a few very instructive columns pointing out the history that the indemnity policy originated, I think, according to your column, sometime in the 1980s.
What the hell do I know about anything?
Sometime in the 1980s, carried on through the 1990s, was extended to, I think, Glenn Clark at the time when he was Premier, when it was facing a criminal matter. But the way it works, as it's been described to me by my officials in the Ministry of Attorney General, is that when a specific case comes up, the cone of silence comes down in terms of the unelected officials, the senior civil servants, communicating directly with their political masters about how to handle the matter. They're not going to seek political direction about how to manage a specific case, civil or criminal. And rightly so. You wouldn't want politicians meddling in a criminal case or a civil case. So when there's this indemnity policy comes up, the cone of silence effectively comes down, and the civil servants are left to deal with apply the policy the best they can using their own judgment.
But I think it would be useful to have an independent, outside person, not somebody involved in BC politics, not somebody who's in government, lay all that out and explain it to people. This is how it happened, this is where it came from, this is what was done here, this is where it came from, this is why it is the way it is. And my understanding is that was what you were thinking of, but where is your thinking on that now?
We're getting very close. The draft terms for the indemnity review are on my desk right now, and I hope to be able to make an announcement soon, certainly within the current session.
And the person who does it, everyone's going to go, that's a good person to do this. It's going to be like the Stephen Owen appointment on the other thing.
I believe so.
So, and you expect to announce that fairly soon?
Yes.
We will take a brief break on Voice of BC with Barry Penner. Stay with us.
Minister Penner has a better appreciation than most people in the province about the importance of water due to his long-term tenure as Environment Minister in the province. He also has a pretty good understanding of First Nations issues, and I think one of the big problems moving forward for the provincial government is over the lack of consultation that the government has had with First Nations about the assigning of water rights in their territories.
Producing over 9,000 hours of local programming every year. This is Shaw TV, your local voice.
As I'm driving to work, I can feel the anxiety building. My stomach starts to get sick. I start to sweat.
It's a feeling of terror, like a life and death situation, basically.
I always feel like I'm, under a spotlight.
I would kill myself at a certain point if things didn't get better.
Anxiety and depressive disorders are the most common of all mental illnesses. For a free mental health screening, call our toll-free number or visit our website today.
Missed something on Voice of BC? Catch an encore presentation of this show on your local Shaw TV. If you live in the Lower Mainland, Voice of BC rebroadcasts Saturday morning at 10:30 and Sunday afternoon at 4. On Vancouver Island, watch Voice of BC Saturday at 10 a.m. or Sunday afternoon at 2. To find out when Voice of BC rebroadcasts in all other parts of the province, please contact your local Shaw TV or check the TV listings for your area.
Kidney disease affects an estimated 2 million Canadians. Many don't even know they have it. But thanks to the Kidney Foundation of Canada's innovative programs and vital research, countless people have been able to turn to us to help them manage, delay, and in some cases even prevent the disease. We're the Kidney Foundation of Canada. Please support us. We're behind you, all the way.
Barry Penner has done quite well for himself over the years. He's gone from being a backbencher and basically the junior MLA among all the Chilliwack ridings to now being the senior MLA, even though the other MLAs in that area haven't changed.
Welcome back to Voice of BC. The incredibly powerful Barry Penner is on the show tonight. Next week on the show, Kevin Falcon is going to be on. Mr. HST himself and the Deputy Premier. Maybe we'll get the Premier herself on the show one of these days too. But lots to talk about. And as I mentioned to people, the new Leader of the Opposition, Adrian Dix, will be on the show in May 19th. And I'm hoping to get toward the end of the session to also get the new House Leader, John Horgan, onto the show as well. So we will have opposition members on the show. Barry Penner, what is this? It's a daffodil you're wearing in your lapel tonight. What's that for?
It's courtesy of the Cancer Society, and every April is Cancer Awareness Month, and this week in the legislature I think all members were wearing this flower in recognition of that, and it's a sign of support for people that are dealing with cancer themselves, and a reminder to all of us to take our own health seriously. At the end of the day, we can contribute significantly to our own odds. I am a cancer survivor myself. I'm due for a checkup in a few weeks. And only I can force myself to go and get that checkup. If I put it off, I'm taking a risk.
Good luck to you. Back to Paul Ramsey, another controversial case in British Columbia. Here's Paul.
In order for a justice system to be perceived as really working for people, we have to have justice that's prompt. Justice delayed is justice denied. We say that for defendants, but it's also true for the general public. They want cases to be disposed of. And that's why trying to resolve the affair of Cash Heed and his violations of the Election Act in BC is such a blot on the justice system. Unless you get some prompt action on this file, the general public will think that the fix is in and that politicians are manipulating our justice system.
You have an election held almost 2 years ago, and Cash Heed is still being hailed by Elections BC for not having filed a complete financial statement of what happened. And it's been 2 years since the election.
So, as Mr. Ramsey should know, even though he's not a lawyer, in BC, when there's an allegation that's made of a criminal nature against an MLA, a special prosecutor is appointed.
Yeah.
And a special prosecutor is independent of government, so politicians don't have a role to play in directing the investigation, and certainly I haven't. But the special prosecutor, in reviewing the matter involving Mr. Heed, did release a report sometime in the last couple of weeks, and did not recommend charges against Mr. Heed. I understand some other individuals are facing serious charges, but not Mr. Heed. There is a parallel matter involving Elections BC that you refer to. My understanding that matter is ongoing, so it would not be appropriate for me to comment more.
But in general, members of the legislature should file the statements they're required to file under the Elections Act, and he hasn't done it.
That's a matter of a dispute about that Mr. Heed has with Elections BC at the moment.
Well, we've got another controversial case, and this one, Leonard Krogh is asking about it. Here's Leonard.
Mr. Penner, if the criminal code provisions relating to polygamy are in fact found to be constitutional, will this government pursue prosecution of people who are involved in polygamous relationships?
Well, again,
it's all minefields tonight, so just...
Mr. Krogh should know, I don't direct prosecutions. At least that's not the normal course. We have a criminal justice branch that operates quite independently of the Attorney General. That's me.
And the previous Attorney General got kind of involved in this one.
And they can. I can give written direction to specific cases, but that's the exception rather than the rule.
Sorry, not previous Attorney General, previous Attorney General. Wally Opal, not Mike Dion.
So here's what's going on. There's been a case that the BC government initiated through our lawyers with the BC Supreme Court, where it was called a reference case. So we're asking the judge to rule, sort of in the abstract, but not really, because we marshaled evidence about what we see as the social harms, particularly to women and children, that is visited upon them because of the polygamous lifestyle. And I think that evidence was pretty compelling, and we fought that case pretty aggressively. When I say we, I mean the lawyers acting for the Attorney General's ministry, led by Chris Jones. And the federal government has joined us in that case. are also arguing that the existing criminal code prohibition on polygamy should be upheld. Incidentally, and I'll add this, almost every Western society that's democratic has similar laws prohibiting polygamy. And you have to ask yourself why that might be. I think it's because there are compelling social reasons to prohibit polygamy. Notwithstanding that, some groups have taken a different view, including the one that the NDP candidate currently running against Christy Clark used to be associated with. The Civil Liberties Association has intervened in that case and argued that, in fact, the polygamy prohibition should be struck down.
And you're referring to David Eby, who was the head of the Civil Liberties Association, correct, resigned in order to run for the NDP, and he is the NDP candidate in Vancouver Point Grey in the by-election on correct, May 11th.
And I am strongly of the view that the social harm that's visited on women and children is simply unacceptable, and that, first of all, I don't agree that there is a charter right that's protected in this way, but even if there were, then if there's what's called the Section 1 analysis under the Charter, is that justified if there is some kind of infringement in a free and democratic society? And we have marshaled significant evidence about the harms, and I would argue strenuously that for women's equality and to protect the interests of children, including young girls, that we've been hearing about being essentially traded across the border and forced into so-called marriages, and I don't accept that those are real marriages, because I believe real marriages are between consenting adults. But 12 and 13-year-old girls being paired off with or paired up with people several times their age is not my idea of a marriage. Anyway, I take the view that that is something that governments need to intervene in, and not just accept that polygamy is something that we're going to have in our society.
Back to Paul Ramsey. This question about access to the courts. Here's Paul.
Mr. Penner, your predecessor started pushing hard to get more cameras in BC's courtrooms. I think the general public thought it was a good idea. They want to know what's going on in those courtrooms, and very few of them can actually have the time to trot down to the courthouse and see what's going on. And yet the judges of the province seem to be stymieing the ministry's efforts to advance that. Can you overcome that resistance of the judges and make sure that courtrooms are open to the public through cameras?
The media, of course, doesn't have any interest in this issue at all. I want that on the record.
Well, in fact, we were just talking about the polygamy case, and it got some notoriety at the end because cameras were allowed into that courtroom to hear the closing arguments. I don't know how many people tuned into that, but I thought that was a positive development, and that was a decision made by the judge presiding over that matter. So it is available for judges to make that decision on a case-by-case basis to allow cameras in the courtroom and to allow them in subject to certain restrictions. The judges could say you can only come in for a certain part of the hearing, or you can only point the camera in a certain direction, avoid witnesses, etc. If you're concerned about witnesses feeling intimidated or nervous, or lawyers for that matter. But the conventional view in Canada that many judges have taken is that they see the potential for mischief, and that it could be detrimental to the administration of justice, I suppose, and having cameras in the courts. I share Mr. Ramsey's view here that most members of the public probably don't ever step foot in a courtroom to see how it really works. I think it would be helpful if more people could, and so it's a topic that I'm interested in, but I realize also that we have to find a solution here that the judges believe is workable for them.
And here's David Schreck, and well, let's see what he has to say. Here's David.
Barry, frequently when controversy hits your ministry, the answer is that the decision is entirely up to the deputy and the minister bears no responsibility. What are some of the hot-button issues for which you do take responsibility?
It is an unusual relationship between the Attorney General and the deputy, particularly on the criminal justice side.
Correct. And so there's the deputy minister, and then there's a number of assistant deputy ministers, and the criminal justice branch, I talked about them earlier, they assert a fair degree of independence. Because, for the obvious reason, you don't want elected people on a routine basis meddling in individual prosecutions of people in the community or so on. But it's obviously there's always checks and balances, and there needs to be accountability, and we count on our elected people and ministers to provide that accountability to the civil service. So there, it's an interesting relationship, and it's one that I'm still learning about because I've only been Attorney General now for a few months. But to his question, what issues am I responsible for? If he's been watching this program, he'll be learning about a number of the items that I am responsible for because you've been asking me about them.
There are occasions where the people that are doing the prosecution do come and tell you that such and such person's under investigation. This issue is going ahead because it's reached the point where it has to happen, right? I mean, there are cases, it's not where they necessarily consult you, but at least where they keep you in the loop.
I'm trying to think of examples in my limited tenure.
Well, it may not have happened to you yet.
And I guess there are around some major trials that are putting, making us have to make some decisions about allocating resources. And one of them had to do with where we have multiple accused facing multiple charges of homicide, and where in order to beef up security in the courtroom, we brought in, or at least we're working towards bringing in correctional officers, giving them some additional training or getting them ready to take on some extra roles within the courthouse so we could free up sheriffs from the cells to provide extra security in the courtroom where we think we could have a high-risk trial.
We have another question from Katrina Pacey, not Spacey as I said earlier, Pivot Legal Society. Here she is.
We know that in the city of Vancouver there's been a massive epidemic of violence against sex workers, and this has been happening all over the province as well as across the country. Court challenges are taking place in an attempt to decriminalize adult prostitution and make the industry safer. And my question is for you as Attorney General, what are you doing to plan for the eventual decriminalization of adult prostitution so that sex workers in this province have equal access to police protection as well as all of the employment and human rights protections that every other worker enjoys?
The day is coming.
We'll see. Hate to pass it on during a federal election to our counterparts, but that is a federal issue because it is currently prohibited in the criminal code, or at least certain aspects of it, communicating, for example. But the charter right protections apply to everyone, regardless of your standing. We also have a human rights code in British Columbia, and that applies to everyone regardless of their social standing or what their occupation is. So we do have those legal protections in place.
What do you think will be the big issue in the next provincial election when it happens?
I think one of the primary issues will be about change. And I think if you take a look at Christy Clark's approach to government, which is a more optimistic and positive outlook looking forward, it'll be a pretty good contrast to the vision presented by Mr. Dix, which tends to be not quite so positive, a bit more negative.
Well, he says it's going to be very positive.
Actions speak louder than words, and we know about how he advised Glenn Clark, the former NDP Premier in the 1990s, and the kind of approach they took to government. And that's quite a contrast to, I think, the approach you're seeing from Christy Clark.
I think we'd both say, though, that there will be a clear choice in the next provincial election and real distinctions between our parties, because there always are. Thank you to Barry Penner for being on the show tonight. Appreciate it. Next week on Voice of BC, Kevin Falcon, Mr. HST himself, will be on the show. And as I said, sometime in May, we're hoping to have Adrian Dix on. Thank you for watching Voice of BC, bringing the legislature, BC politics into your living room. Good night.